It started with a tomato. Not just any tomato, this was a radiant, sun-kissed heirloom cultivar passed down from my grandfather, a third-generation farmer from Southern California. For me, gardening wasn't a hobby. It was therapy, a meditation, a quiet rebellion against a digital world obsessed with instant gratification. And so, every morning before booting up my work laptop, I tended to my tiny patch of green behind the split-rail fence of my suburban home in Springwood, Oregon. But that morning, coffee in hand, socks still creased from sleep, I stepped onto my porch and froze. The tomato was gone. Not fallen. Not bitten by wildlife. Just vanished. The vines were intact, the stem snipped with suspicious precision, and the soil undisturbed. It wasn't the first time I'd had an annoying squirrel raid my cucumbers, but this was different. This was theft. I stood still for a full minute, my mug cooling rapidly in the brisk morning air, staring at the empty spot on the vine where my prized tomato once hung. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned, like someone had stolen my journal or taken a bite out of a painting. By noon, I had convinced myself it was a fluke. Maybe some kid thought it was funny. Maybe it had been a squirrel with a taste for premium produce. But 2 days later, the same thing happened again, this time. 3 tomatoes gone. No prints. No footprints. No signs of struggle. Just empty stems. That's when I bought the cameras. 2 wireless security cams disguised as hummingbird feeders, plus motion detection alerts routed straight to my phone. I wasn't paranoid. I was curious. Curious in the way a man becomes when something he cares about gets messed with. Within 3 days, my curiosity paid off. At precisely 4:13 a.m., a figure appeared on the footage. Small frame, oversized straw hat, gardening gloves, pink Crocs. Karen Halstead. I blinked, paused, rewound. It was unmistakable. She strutted into my yard like it was her Sunday farmer's market, picked 3 ripe tomatoes, tucked them in a cloth bag, and walked out calm, casual, like she owned the place. And in a way, she thought she did. Karen was the chair of our HOA's landscaping committee. She sent out weekly emails about shrub height compliance and once fined a neighbor for ornamental imbalance in their flower bed. Her yard? A sterile showpiece of symmetrical hedges, concrete pavers, and exactly 6 marigolds per row. We'd clashed before. She didn't like my wildflower border. Said it looked feral. I said it looked alive. So maybe this was her way of punishing me. But walking into someone's private property at 4 a.m. to steal tomatoes? That was beyond HOA policy. That was personal. Now I could have taken the footage straight to the HOA board, filed a trespassing report, called her out in the neighborhood Facebook group. But something in me, a spark, a prankster impulse inherited from my granddad, urged a different path. And that's when the Carolina Reapers entered the chat. I'd stumbled across a YouTube video titled Carolina Reaper Challenge, Man Screams for 10 Minutes. The idea hit me like thunder. If Karen loved my tomatoes so much, I'd give her something unforgettable. Something that would scorch her soul. Within the hour, I had 6 Reaper seedlings sitting in my online cart. 3 days later, I planted them carefully among my tomato rows. Their leaves looked similar. The stems blended in. But the fruit? They were napalm disguised as candy. I watered them like they were sacred. I whispered encouragements. I apologized in advance for what I was about to do with them. They were my spicy sentinels, growing brighter and bolder by the day. By week's end, they were ripe. Now, let me tell you something about Carolina Reapers. These aren't your average hot peppers. They're weapons. The kind of burn that skips your tongue and goes straight to your ancestors. One bite, and you rethink every life choice that led you there. And I wanted Karen to have that bite. I rearranged the garden subtly, placing the Reapers near the front. I camouflaged them with tomato leaves and even left a small sign that read, "Please don't pick, pollination in progress," hoping reverse psychology might help. Then I waited. The first night? Nothing. Second night? Teenager. Wrong thief. Poor kid grabbed one, bit in, and sprinted for the nearest sprinkler like his mouth was on fire. It was. I felt a little bad, but it was still not Karen. But on the third night, she returned. Decked in her usual night raid gear, hat, gloves, Crocs, and a tote bag, she crept into my yard, crouched low, and plucked the most sinister-looking Reaper of the bunch. I watched from my bedroom window, heart pounding. She sniffed it, smiled, and bit. The scream that followed cracked the morning silence like a gunshot. She spun in place, waving her arms like she'd been sprayed by bees, then stumbled toward my hose, tripped over my stepping stones, and doused herself face first in muddy sprinkler water. Her screams echoed into the darkness, waking the Johnsons, the Parkers, and likely half of Springwood. It was majestic. I had created art. But the next day, a letter appeared on my door. HOA letterhead. Urgent, hazardous plants violation. Signed by Karen. The war had officially begun. There was something almost poetic about the irony. Karen had stolen from my garden under cover of darkness, suffered the consequences of her own greed, and then tried to punish me for it. The HOA letter was full of stiff, legal-sounding jargon, reckless cultivation of hazardous flora, community safety violation, and my personal favorite, deliberate botanical endangerment. I half expected it to accuse me of agricultural terrorism. At the bottom, scrawled in her overly cursive signature, was Karen Halstead's name, next to her title, Chairwoman, Springwood HOA Landscaping Committee. It was ridiculous, but also dangerous. Because Karen knew the handbook better than anyone. She had practically rewritten it. And if she was going to weaponize bylaws against me, then I needed more than spicy peppers. I needed strategy. First, I reviewed the footage again frame by frame. Karen, for 13 a.m., entering my property, bag in hand, reaching into my garden. I clipped the video, added timestamps, and burned it to a flash drive labeled Exhibit A. Then I checked the HOA handbook. I'd printed the full 84-page PDF years ago, mostly for laughs. Turns out, page 63 had a clause about harvestable vegetation, and nothing in it prohibited hot peppers. In fact, it explicitly allowed seasonal produce for personal consumption. Personal consumption. If someone else stole that produce and got burned, that was on them. But Karen wasn't playing by the rules. She never did. Her real power came not from logic or truth, but from persistence. She buried people in paperwork, turned neighbors against each other with gossip disguised as concern, and used fear like fertilizer. Her goal wasn't justice, it was dominance. And now she had set her sights on me. Well, not just me. Something had shifted in the neighborhood since the incident. People whispered in driveways, smirked over hedges, and chuckled as they watered their roses. I overheard 2 joggers refer to Karen as the Ghost Pepper Queen. Kids were daring each other to sneak into my yard and snap selfies with the infamous plants. I had accidentally gone viral, at least locally. And the impact was growing. Jerry, my next-door neighbor, the same guy who once mowed his lawn while holding a baby monitor and drinking a light beer, knocked on my door that Friday evening. "You got a minute?" he asked, unusually serious. I stepped outside. "I've been thinking," he began, glancing around. "Karen's gone too far. Again. And I'm not the only one who thinks so." He explained how he'd overheard Karen berating Margaret, the HOA secretary, for allowing an amateur farmer to run amok. Apparently, Karen had demanded emergency authority to enact new landscaping restrictions without a community vote. "She's trying to ban gardens now," Jerry said. "Real ones. Not just yours." That's when I got the idea. The Reaper prank was funny, sure, but it wasn't enough anymore. Karen had declared war, and I needed an escalation. Not one that would get me arrested, but something powerful. Something she couldn't spin or slander. Something legendary. That's when I remembered the farmer's market. 2 weeks prior, I had overheard a pair of old-school growers talking about pepper hybrids. Specifically, one of them was working on crossing a Carolina Reaper with a ghost pepper. Hotter than either parent, one had said. Like eating a volcano with nerves. At the time, I laughed. Now, I was inspired. So I began researching forums, gardening sites, YouTube videos. I learned how to hand-pollinate peppers, isolate pollen, and label generations. It was part science, part obsession. My nights were spent with tweezers and cotton swabs. My days were spent dodging HOA violations. Karen sent 2 more warnings, one for unsightly garden architecture, my compost bin, and one for unauthorized wildlife encouragement, a bee hotel. I framed them both in my kitchen like war medals. Meanwhile, my hybrid seedlings grew in secret, thanks to Jerry, who offered me his old tool shed as a stealth greenhouse. We set up grow lights, humidity monitors, and even a tiny ventilation system. It became our war room. The Resistance HQ. It wasn't just Jerry, either. Margaret started slipping notes into my mailbox. Encouraging notes. She'd drawn tiny chili peppers in the margins and signed them M. The first read, "Let her burn herself out." The second, "Tomatoes unite." I wasn't alone anymore. But Karen didn't know that. She thought she was still in control. That her passive-aggressive reign was unshaken. That the incident was a fluke. So I let her believe that. And I kept planting. The peppers were terrifying. Vivid reds and blistered oranges, with bumpy skins like molten lava frozen mid-eruption. I'd never seen anything like them. They looked angry. Alive. I named the best one the Springwood Scorcher. That was the one I planned to use. The next HOA meeting loomed. I knew Karen would bring another complaint. Probably cite community safety or toxicity levels. Maybe even drag in a fake expert. But I was ready. I wasn't just bringing documents or videos. I was bringing the pepper. The night before the meeting, I stood in the shed, holding the Scorcher like it was a nuclear core. It practically vibrated in my fingers. This wasn't about payback anymore. It was about reclaiming sanity, dismantling tyranny, burning down the absurdity of suburban politics, one bite at a time. Tomorrow, Karen would either admit defeat or taste it. The day of the HOA meeting arrived cloaked in tension, thick as pollen in spring, and just as irritating. Neighbors who normally avoided eye contact now watched from their porches as I walked past, carrying a canvas grocery bag. Inside was a sealed glass container with a paper towel-lined base, protecting 3 slices of the most powerful botanical weapon I had ever grown. The Springwood Scorcher gleamed like cut rubies, each piece innocently small, yet radiating danger. My hands weren't shaking, but they might as well have been. I wasn't nervous about the meeting. I was nervous about winning. About what it meant to finally dethrone Karen Halstead from her porcelain pedestal of HOA power, built on years of pettiness and paranoia. The community center, where HOA meetings were held every quarter, had never seen this much foot traffic. SUVs and hybrids lined the curb. Someone even parked on Karen's beloved no parking strip, and nobody moved it. Inside, the air was humid with anticipation. Rows of plastic chairs were filled, mostly with bored retirees, skeptical spouses, and a few young parents holding restless toddlers. And there she was. Karen sat at the front table like a dethroned queen still clinging to her imaginary crown. Her face was flushed, not from peppers this time, but from the growing realization that her iron grip was slipping. She wore her signature pastel cardigan, but this one had a small embroidered chili pepper on the lapel, clearly an attempt at controlling the narrative. The meeting started as they always did, with boring budget summaries, landscaping schedules, and a vote about repainting the community pool fence. No one cared. We were all here for the showdown. Then, as if flipping a switch, Karen cleared her throat and launched into her safety concern agenda item. It has come to my attention, she began, her voice syrupy and falsely sweet, that certain residents have chosen to cultivate extremely hazardous plant matter in direct violation of Section 11.3b of our community's gardening guidelines. She didn't look at me, but everyone else did. She continued, just last week, a neighborhood youth suffered a traumatic experience after ingesting what was believed to be a tomato, but was, in fact, a weaponized pepper. Gasps. A few scattered mms. Someone stifled a snort. Karen pressed on. And while I fully support the joys of home gardening, we must consider the safety of our community, of our children, of our pets. She placed her hand over her heart. I propose an immediate suspension of all spicy crop cultivation until we can review their potential risk. She sat back, eyes locked on the board. Her supporters nodded like wind-up dolls. That's when I stood. Madam Chair, I said, and the room quieted. If I may respond to these accusations with a demonstration? Karen stiffened. I reached into the grocery bag and placed the glass container on the center table, carefully removing the lid with theatrical slowness. The Scorcher slices glistened in the overhead lights. Gasps turned to whispers. Phones came out. Someone's toddler pointed and said, "Fire tomatoes." Karen tilted her head. "Mr. Miller, what is the meaning of this?" "You've accused me of endangering the neighborhood," I said, calmly. "So I brought a sample of the crop you find so threatening." The room went silent again. "Now, I won't ask anyone else to eat this." "That would be unfair," I said, turning slightly. "But since you've insisted they're a danger to the public, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate that risk firsthand?" It was a trap, and Karen knew it. But Karen also had something stronger than common sense, pride. She hesitated. The silence stretched. Then, with a tight smile, she reached out and picked up the smallest piece. "I'm not afraid of some chili tomato," she muttered. And she ate it. For a second, there was nothing. Then, everything happened at once. Karen's face twisted, her eyes widened, and she bent forward, clutching the table like it was the only thing tethering her to earth. A strangled wheeze escaped her lips. Her cardigan grew blotchy with sweat. She reached blindly for her reusable water bottle, missed, and knocked it to the floor. People gasped. Others laughed. Jerry straight up howled. Karen staggered backward, mouth gaping, making inhuman noises as she fumbled toward the exit. "Water!" she shrieked. "Call someone. Poison. This is sabotage." She tripped over a folding chair and went down like a poorly programmed robot. Two HOA members rushed to her side, while Margaret, ever composed, stood and quietly picked up the container. "This," she said to the room, "is what we're calling a community safety hazard." Murmurs erupted. Phones recorded. Neighbors whispered and chuckled. It was over. Karen didn't return to her seat. She didn't return to the meeting. The board voted to reject her proposed suspension and agreed to review the HOA gardening guidelines with input from multiple residents. Margaret was appointed interim chair. Karen's influence was effectively scorched, reduced to ash by the very spice she accused me of weaponizing. That night, back in my yard, I sat on the porch under the quiet hush of a late Oregon sky. A tomato in one hand, a slice of scorcher in the other. Victory had never tasted so sweet and so hot. But this wasn't just about tomatoes anymore. It was about what we allowed in our communities. About pushing back when absurdity dresses itself up in regulation. About standing your ground and growing something worth defending. The peppers weren't just plants. They were protest. And this protest had bloomed. Springwood changed after that night. Not all at once, and not with some grand declaration, but subtly, like frost melting from rooftops in the morning sun. The kind of shift that begins with a single neighbor planting a cherry tomato vine where they used to have a lawn gnome, or another hanging a wooden sign that read, Herb's HOA. It was rebellion by cultivation. Silent defiance through raised beds and compost bins. Karen Halstead, former chair of the HOA Landscaping Committee, had become a ghost, both figuratively and, depending on whom you asked, almost literally. She hadn't been seen in days. The last rumor claimed she'd been spotted at the urgent care center, demanding to see a toxicologist about pepper-related nerve damage. Another neighbor said she was recovering at her sister's lake house, emotionally scarred from horticultural sabotage. No one knew for sure. What was certain, the woman who once controlled our yards, our fences, our mailbox colors, now couldn't show her face without someone whispering, "Scorch her." Meanwhile, my garden had become a local attraction. It started with curious glances. Then came questions. What soil do you use? Where'd you get those seedlings? Is it true the pepper melted her mascara? By the end of the week, I was hosting impromptu backyard Q&A sessions. Retirees showed up with notepads. Teenagers asked to pose next to the reaper plants like tourists at a celebrity's home. One guy, an actual chef from a nearby restaurant, offered to buy my entire next batch of scorchers. But not everything was applause and admiration. Karen may have lost her title, but her influence had left deep roots. A faction of die-hard rule followers, who I secretly called the Order of the Beige Mailbox, began murmuring about anarchy in landscaping, uncontrolled vegetation, and even neighborhood decline. They circulated petitions, demanded tighter plant regulations, sent snide emails suggesting some gardens promote danger and division. I ignored them, because something bigger was happening. Gardening became contagious. Jerry, once a lawn-only minimalist, installed vertical planters on his fence and filled them with chili peppers. "It's my tribute," he said, grinning. Margaret added a row of basil to the front of the HOA building because herbs deserve rights too, she quipped. Even the Wilsons, an elderly couple who had never once changed their front porch decor in 20 years, dug up their decorative gravel and replaced it with lavender, tomatoes, and zucchini. We called it the Green Rebellion. And it was glorious. The HOA tried to respond. A few leftover loyalists attempted to revive the old rules, citing obscure clauses about plant height and visual symmetry. But Margaret, now acting chair, played it smart. She rewrote the handbook, one line at a time. In its new form, it included phrases like "gardens of diverse form are encouraged," and "no single aesthetic standard shall override personal expression through flora." She even added a Karen clause, a tongue-in-cheek section banning members from inspecting other yards without written invitation. It passed unanimously. And Karen? She never returned to the board. Her emails stopped. Her passive-aggressive flyers disappeared from porches. Eventually, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn, tilted slightly, as if embarrassed to be there. The night before she moved, I caught sight of her one last time. She stood at the edge of her front steps, a cardboard box in hand, staring at my garden across the street. My tomatoes glowed under the porch light. The scorcher vines had withered for the season, their mission complete. Our eyes met for a brief moment. She didn't wave, but she didn't scowl either. Just a nod, almost respectful, maybe even defeated. Then she turned and went inside. That was the last time anyone saw her in Springwood. In the months that followed, gardening became more than a trend. It became a way for the neighborhood to reclaim its identity. We hosted a hot pepper festival in July. Kids painted signs that said "Pollinate peace" and "No snails, no tyrants." The community bulletin board, once reserved for Karen's mandates, now overflowed with seed exchanges, composting tips, and invites to backyard harvest parties. As for me, I kept gardening. I expanded into jalapenos, eggplants, and even watermelons. My grandfather would have been proud. But I also kept one small corner of the yard reserved for something special. Each year, I plant a few Springwood scorchers, not for revenge, not anymore, but as a reminder. A reminder that when absurdity takes root in power, it sometimes takes a ridiculous act to uproot it. One bite, one scream, one pepper, and everything changed. Springwood was no longer the same, and neither was I. What started as a petty act of nighttime theft over a few tomatoes had turned into a slow-burning revolution, one fueled by compost, cayenne, and collective defiance. It wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about the quiet tyranny that had blanketed our neighborhood for years, enforced through the most banal of means: emails about hedge height, citations for garden gnomes, silent shaming over untamed flower beds. The scorcher didn't just end Karen's rule. It unearthed something that had been buried deep beneath our fences and facade smiles, our weariness with control disguised as order. In the months after her departure, the community underwent a metamorphosis. It began with an amendment to the HOA charter, spearheaded by Margaret and surprisingly co-authored by Jerry. It was titled the Cultivation Clause, and it declared every resident's right to maintain a personal garden, regardless of layout, crop type, or aesthetic preference, so long as it did not obstruct public walkways or pose actual safety risks. But beyond policy, something subtler and more beautiful happened. People talked to each other again. Fences that once served as lines of defense became trellises for shared vines. Saturday mornings turned into garden walkabouts. Retired engineer Ron next door created a hand-drawn map of who was growing what on the block and updated it monthly. The Johnson kids built a bee motel and were thrilled when real bees moved in. Even HOA meetings changed. Gone were the stiff rows and power plays. Now they were potlucks, with rosemary focaccia, tomato bruschetta, and yes, homemade scorcher hot sauce, used very sparingly. People who'd once avoided each other now swapped soil hacks and seedling tips. Our neighborhood, once the model of sterile compliance, had bloomed into something far more alive. And me? I found myself not only with the most popular garden in Springwood, but an unexpected new identity: the pepper guy. Not the title I'd imagined earning at 34, but one I wore with pride. I'd even been invited to speak at the Spring County Home Growers Festival. My panel? From passive plants to powerful protest, how one pepper changed a community. I thought they were joking at first. They weren't. I didn't seek revenge anymore. I didn't need it. Karen had left. Her house was sold to a young couple who immediately ripped up the sterile hedges and planted sunflowers and spinach. When I saw them one morning, I waved. They waved back. Balance had returned. But there was still one last thing I needed to do. It happened on a crisp Saturday morning, almost a year to the day after the first tomato went missing. I woke up early, brewed my usual cup of dark roast, and walked barefoot through dew-damp grass to the far corner of my yard, where the scorchers had once stood in battle formation. There, I dug a small hole. Nothing fancy. I placed a single dried pod of the original scorcher into the earth, said nothing, and buried it. Not as a threat, not as a warning, as a marker, a monument, to mischief, to resistance, to gardening. And maybe, just maybe, as a seed for future stories. Because in neighborhoods like ours, drama doesn't disappear. It just goes dormant, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. As I stood, brushing the dirt from my hands, I looked out across Springwood. It shimmered with life: roses and radishes, trellised peas and wild mint, laughter and bees. Not perfect. Never perfect. But ours. And all because one woman couldn't keep her hands off someone else's tomato.